This is Symbols 4, and with this particular presentation, we come to another node, another sub-phase, as it were. Our education is following a quality of motion which lends itself, in retrospect, to a geometricity. In other words, there's a geometric periodicity that we can now notice and underline, underscore, and make available to ourselves. And we can realize that we're participating in a universal movement. This education's motion, its progress, its line of development, its integral path, its differential radial angular momentum development, all of it participates consciously in a universal structure. Perhaps the most indelible intellectual idea of this structure came in the 19th century from a Russian named Mendeleev. And Mendeleev, around 1868, 1870, in the closing years of the 1860s, developed for the first time the idea that the elements of the universe arrange themselves in groups that follow a periodicity formula, and designed for the very first time, which included only 60 elements, a periodic table of elements. This was a startling intellectual idea, one which I think balances out Mendeleev's discovery of the basis of genetic inheritance. Mendeleev also was the one who did experiments in his garden with the crossing of colors of sweet peas. If you take one white and one red, you will get pink and white and red in a geometric formation. That genetic inheritance follows a quaternary frame of referential, that the transitions from generation to generation of species, not just plants or insects, but of mammals, of ourselves, that the movement of life through a genetic phase form transformation has a structure to it, and the structure is arranged in a quaternary type of arrangement, where out of that quaternary, two will be, quote, normal, one will be dominant, and one will be recessive. So that there's the perception intellectually raised to a conception by Mendeleev about 130 years ago, 150 years ago. He was working on this, that the movement of life has a definite form, and the transmission of the whole field, the entire array of genetic information, is encoded in a set of coordinates that are recognizable, that are so definite that one can predict with great accuracy what is going to happen with various crosses, various grafts, various interchanges in breeding. This four-part symbol of the structure of genetic inheritance was complemented by Mendeleev's understanding of an 8-part structure in the way in which atomic elements in nature arrange themselves. And indeed, not only do the 92 known elements arrange themselves very accurately in an 8-part Mendeleev structure. But all the elements that have been discovered up to element, I believe, 107 or 108, also fall into this family, this grouping, this set, this 8-part set. But in the century and a third that has taken place since Mendeleev and the discovery of many more elements and the use of the periodic table to understand the in-depth nature of atomic structure, of electron orbits, orbitals as they're called, of quantum numbers, of the way in which angular numbers and radial numbers combined together give a detailed structure of the atomic 8-fold family. In recent years, in the last generation, a renumbering of those 8 families have taken place because some of the families were divided into A's and B's and C's and so forth. So now there is an 18-part characterization. And if you went to something like Oxford Science Publications, the late 1980s, the Periodic Table of the Elements, 2nd edition, you would find in the back of it, the Periodic Table of Elements now has 18 members. And still at the top, the Roman numerals 1 through 8, which Mendeleev used originally, still hold. The idea for us, the conception for us, the powerful symbolic realization for us, the elements of the inorganic universe arrange themselves in an 8-part set of characteristics which is indelible. And complemented to that, organic materials in their evolution, in their genetic transmission of continuance, in their flow of actuality, obey a 4-part, a 4 noble truths and an 8-fold path. Do you understand that the power of symbolic realization transcends our species? Let me say it again. Any conscious entity, regardless of the planetary heritage within which it grew up, on any star system, in any galactic structure, would discover in this universe that the 8-part quality of material existential reality complements a quaternary structure of life, movement, and evolution development. And in a way, the secret kind of core of all of this, the reason that this operates, the operative structural cue in all this is pairing. And the most fundamental way to understand this is that pairs squared are 4s, pairs cubed are 8s. And 8s are also squares squared. So that pairing, as Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching observes, of what can be said, pairing is the deepest of all. And that one can go, like Plato's aletheia, Plato's truth, one can go deeper than the pair and come to an unsplittable thusness. The Socratic dialectic is a paired conversation. which reoccurs all throughout human thought, regardless of whether they have read Plato or not. It would reoccur throughout any intelligent philosophy in any star system. It is not only a universal form, it is a cosmic consciousness. It registers in such a way that even sound can be organized according to an octave, an 8-part structure. And it can be applied in many other realms, one of which we're looking at now, our education. So that the form of this education is not only universal, it is cosmic also. It is universal in its origin, it is cosmic in its purpose. Not because I say so, but because it is discoverably so by application. This is an education which is fully conscious. It's not a good idea of this time. It's not a summation of ideas of the past. It is universally and cosmically valid and sound as a procedure. Will always work on any scale of detail, no matter how small, no matter how large, no matter where the applicability is directed. So if you're so smart, how come you ain't rich? Well, the smart are never rich. It's always the second generation that get rich. The pioneers never get rich. They get happy in knowing that it's done. You're the people who are going to get rich by applying it, because it will work forever for you, regardless of the situation, regardless of the population mix of people. There is a way to apply this education to whatever, whenever, with any degree of accuracy that you require, with any degree of context which you need to consult. Our 4-part structure occurs in an annual phase, and that annual phase doubles itself so that we have a 2-year program. We have a 2-year program because that's the way in which an 8-part, a 2 cubed, a square squared would work. Now, if you square a square, you would get a 16. 4 times 4 is 16. Why do you not get 16? Why do you get 8? Because the square squared turns out to be a pair. If you have 4 times 4, if you have a 16, there are developments in human intelligence, concentrations of contemplation, like the Abhidhamma of Buddhism, where a single moment of thought actually does have a 16-part structure. But 8 parts, quote, parts of that structure are never discernible. Only 8 parts are discernible. Even though 16 would be there, technically, absolutely, 8 of them are always undiscernible and do not occur with any individuality whatsoever. To use a musical analogy, they always occur as a trill, an invisible trill. So that a moment of thought, a citta, a bodhicitta, though it has a 16-part structure, only 8 parts of which occur at any one time. So when you see an Indian presentation of the wheel of Dharma, it has 8 spokes. Though 16 would be an accurate technical quality. And in fact, they wanted to have a 16-part wheel as the flag of India, after they decided not to use Gandhi's charkha, his spinning wheel, at the center of the Indian flag, which it was used for the first couple of weeks. I happen to have one of those rare Gandhian India independent flags with the spinning wheel at the center. But later on, the wheel had many more spokes than 16. One cannot have 16. One has 8. 8 that are applicable, that are usable. And so in a very odd way, one gets into an arithmetical paradox where multiplicity and additionality operate together, which means that subtractability and divisionality also cooperate together. And one can go very far with this kind, not of a metaphysics, but like a transcendent arithmetically conditioned intelligence. Now, if we pursue this kind of a train, we quickly go outside of the realm in which our education is focusing. We're constantly needing to feed ourselves back in, fold ourselves back in. And that's why the first year of the education is characterized most accurately by integration. As we come to the symbols section and look back in retrospect and begin to realize that there's a periodicity to all of this. Symbols 4 means that we have come to the first of 3 movements of the symbols course. We've come to a conclusion of it. Symbols 4, symbols 8, and symbols 12 will mark periodicity in the symbols phase. And the symbols phase itself is the 4th phase out of the first year's cycle. And one can look back and see that symbols 4 has a kind of a diametric affinity and opposition with ritual 4. That if you put on this circle nature, ritual, myth, symbol, and you draw a diagonal across, you'll see that symbol and ritual are related together. They're related in a parallel kind of a way, just as nature and myth are related together. And one can understand in a very cursory and yet usable paradigm, nature and myth are processes, ritual and symbol are objectivities. Ritual is objective for the body, symbols are objective for the mind. Nature is a process that allows the body to emerge existentially real. Myth is a process that allows symbols to emerge existentially real. So that a symbolic idea emerges out of language, much like an existential being or form emerges out of nature. So that language and nature are like oceans that allow for life to occur within them and to move out from them. As long as life is still oceanic, it has a kind of a ceiling on it. The developmental possibilities of life, as long as it remains in the ocean, has a certain kind of a ceiling on it. As soon as life crawls out of the ocean, crawls onto land, the possibilities of development jump by many orders. While one can have an intelligence in the ocean like whales and dolphins, our quality of intelligence would not develop there in the ocean. We had to emerge out onto land. And from the crawling to the standing to the reaching to the far seeing, that kind of development is extraordinary. The same is true of the objectivities of the mind. As long as the mind remains in the ocean of language, in the ocean of myth, the ocean of experience, as long as the mind remains there in that initial context within which it is born, within which it grows and reaches a certain kind of maturity, it also has a ceiling, it has a limitation. But the emergence of objectivities in the mind out of the ocean of language, out of the context of actual natural experience, where would you emerge? Where would you crawl ashore? You would crawl ashore on an other shore, as the Buddha would say. Again and again in his sermons, and some 1,500 sermons of the Buddha have been recorded, he never talked about what was on the other shore, but always talked about the other shore being there, being objectively available, but not to be talked about because it cannot be talked about in terms of the language of myth. The language of experience has no way to characterize what would be objective on the other shore. The limits of the ability of the language of experience to express reach their culmination in increasingly compact integrals in the mind, forms in the mind, objectivities in the mind. And as they become more and more compact, more and more folded in, more and more able to integrate, one finally comes, like one came in Plato's dialogues, to the deepest pair of all, that once they joined together, you had a one that was indivisible. And in Plato, it was known as the One. Even 800 years later, someone as intelligent as Plotinus still used that designation, the One. The One is the good. The One is the archetypal form of all forms. And being the form of forms, it is unique. The whole Christian idea of God in the early centuries, before all the great councils and revisions and doctrine wars, was always based upon the recognition that God is the good, God is the one, the indivisible, the unique, the actual, the objective culmination of all meaning, of all objectivity, of all bodies, the universe focused to a single point, the universe that is brought to a single pivot upon which its turning occurs. Now, it takes a lot of energy in order to raise this quality of vision, and it takes a tremendous dynamic of character to carry it through. Not everyone can hear this language. And of those that can hear this language, even fewer can focus it. And even fewer can focus it in the fluid motion of an educational situation. Part of what's going on here is like an exercise in contemplation. It's like a calisthenic of meditation. You are almost imperceptibly becoming stronger and stronger. You're having more and more capacity. Now, this capacity, as it refines itself, as it presents itself as a possibility for the exercising of a larger world, of a world, where would it enlarge to? It cannot enlarge the integral cycle, because that is compacting, that's coming to a focus, coming to a point. That larger world is a differential consciousness, the easiest analogy of which is to imagine the single-pointed focus having the ability to resonate, to be struck by the gong of realization. That single focus is not some kind of a dead point, not an ultimate box canyon, but has a resonant quality. The characteristic of the resonance is that all resonances are consonant from that particular point. The most convenient 20th century imaginative form that was delegated to this was that like a target. Then materialistic behavioral psychology early in the 20th century, a man who had the wonderful symbolic name of Boring. Mr. Boring, Professor Boring, even had this kind of three-dimensional spherical target concentric model of consciousness that one could detect behavior and predict. And indeed, predictability is possible, but what one predicts when one begins to understand differential consciousness is that it is forever and always consonantly open, proteanly capable of something new. And what is characteristic of differential consciousness is that it is structurally free. And so one runs across intelligent statements like the one written down by Bertrand Russell one time. He asked, if thought is so powerful, why do not all people recognize this and learn to think? And then he added the telling phrase, because thought is wild. And most people, once they get the intuition that they can think, but that thought is wild, it will go where it wants to go, explore what it would like to explore, and leaves almost constantly and forever the familiar behind. People stop thinking at that point, at that realization. In fact, they refuse to learn. They will not hear. Not that they cannot, they will not. And what is characteristic of ignorance beyond kindergarten level, from first grade on, is an egotistical willfulness that one will not go further. Because the further one goes, the more incessantly one has to leave behind any kind of secure, comfortable status quo. And this is intuited on fundamental immature level as precarious, as dangerous, as a threat, as imaginative death, as unknown abyss, most fearful of all, phobic projections. This is not the case at all. And one becomes used to the openness, just as birds are reptiles that learn to fly. And they stopped being reptiles and became birds. The scales opened up and feathers came out. So the bird is always used as a kind of symbol for the spirit quality of man, who has learned to resonate with consonance outside the ultimate focus of his own meaning, of her own meaning, of all meaning. And it is this resonance that we explore in the second year, the differential consonance of consciousness. But because it's founded on, because it's related to the pattern of the way in which nature integrates itself, differential consciousness has a complementation in form and in content to the four-part structure of integration, the cycle of natural integration. is complemented by a cycle of conscious differentiation. Sometimes one is called the descent to the inner center, and the other is called the ascent from the inner center back out. One starts the descent not from this skin. The descent starts from the universe at large and goes all the way to that point of focus which is at your center, at all of our centers. And our ascent begins from that point. Not an ascent from where the ego is, not an ascent from where the mind is, not an ascent where the body is. One can write, "Here I stand," but like Martin Luther, but one's ascent doesn't begin from where you stand. It begins at that very center of the integral focus. And so the very first movement of ascent is as hidden as the last movement of integration. And so it's mysterious. In fact, it is traditionally, in the English language, for about 600 years now, referred to as a movement within the cloud of unknowing. It is most definitely a movement, actually occurs, and one can see the effects and the results, and later on one can see the objectivity. But when the first objectivity of the movement of mystery, of ascent occurs, that object does not resemble in any way a natural form, has a different quality. And so the time-honored image that's given to it, which is inaccurate because it's like a cribbing of the old and carrying it to the new. Nevertheless, it's traditional and should be used at least initially. The old idea of the integral stuff of reality, the bedrock of existence, is a rock. The most fundamental image that one has of what is naturally real in the universe, existentially the basis, is a rock, whereas the first differential form is a crystal, a prism, a shaped crystal like a prism. And the difference between the objectivity of a rock and the objectivity of a crystal is that a rock only absorbs light, whereas a crystal can also diffract light. Reflect, diffract, many other things. Focus. One can use a crystal to observe the spectrum of light which is entering it. The whole science of optics, developed by Sir Isaac Newton originally, is all based on this, so that the crystal is able symbolically to go into its own structure and allow one to learn to analyze. But the crystal is perhaps not the best symbol to use for the first objective form in differential consciousness. The prism is a better example, because the prism is always the result of a creatively shaped, a purposefully creatively shaped objectivity. And so in our first half year of the second year of our education, what we'll be looking at is the way in which a prism is a functioning symbol of the person. A differentially conscious person is like a prism. They're able to reflect light. They're able to diffract light. They're able to analyze light. They're able to show the entire spectrum, or they're able to be iridescently scintillating in a medium which in nature could only be absorbed. All the rock can do in light is be a rock. And on the level of initial existence in the universe, that's all it needs to be. It doesn't need to be any more than that. If you look at the letters of an alphabet, A only needs to be A. It doesn't need to be P or X or Z. It doesn't even need to be B. It shouldn't be B. If A were all those things, one would not have the other letters. And so rocks are simply rocks because they need to be simply rocks. So that traditionally, in the East Asia wisdom tradition, the first fundamental Zen recognition is that the rock is a rock. Or, in the words of Ikkyu, one of Japan's most exciting Zen writers, the rock has rockness. Thank goodness. But Ikkyu also wrote the famous koan. Roses are not red, leaves are not green, beware, beware. Because with differential consciousness, one can now go beyond, totally beyond, I mean absolutely beyond, big time, para, very big time meta. From the conditional, the necessary conditional delimitations and limitations that the integral cycle needed to have in order to be real. But our scale of reality is staggeringly free, unbelievably free. Occasionally there have been human beings who have got it, who have got the para big time, who got the meta in lights. One such example was the German romantic genius poet Schiller, who wrote an ode to freedom, which staggered Goethe because he could understand it, and staggered a friend of the two of them, Beethoven, who also could understand it, and set his whole Ninth Symphony to be a musical celebration of that ode to freedom, mistranslated as ode to joy by English-speaking people that didn't want to get that far out, that couldn't afford to get that far out. Those kinds of English-speaking people who no longer read Shelley, who think of Shelley as a bad boy who wrote exotic excesses. But one can get very far out. Big time. And one can go beyond the prism of the person in differential consciousness to an objectivity that is startling. And that objectivity is the reality of the cosmos. And just as the objectivity of the body becomes the objectivity of the mind, and the objectivity of the mind reascends and becomes the objectivity of the person, the objectivity of the person reascends and becomes the objectivity of the cosmos. And the cosmos is the conscious differential unity, complement to what existence is. That existence has a pair. It not only has a pair at the focus of the inner symbolic objectivity. Colloquially, one would say existence has a pair with the soul. Any soul is powerful enough to be a pair to all of existence. But even more startling than that, existence has a direct pairedness to the cosmos, which means the soul has a direct pairedness to the cosmos. So one's not talking about something really humbly insignificant here when one's talking about one's barycenter, about the interior focus of you. But notice here that there is a conundrum, there's a confusion, there's a blur. There's a blur which the ego always projects out, has to project out, needs to. Its whole structure is made to make this projection. The ego's very survival of its existentiality is based on its ability to deceive us with this necessary blur. Because when you correct for the blur, the ego winks out as if it had never been. It's like astigmatism in the universe, that when it's corrected, where does the stigmatism go? It doesn't happen anymore at all. Leaves no trace. There's no soot anyplace. On any level, atomic, molecular, psychic, there's no trace at all. And so one calls it, again, India has all these wonderful words because the yogis were relentless. It calls it moksha, extinction. Finito. In Mexico, the bandits call it finito. The objectivity of existence, when brought into play in the process of language, has a provisional unity and focus and form which obviates against the interiorization of language reaching its ultimate. The movement of experience allows for just so much integration and no more. And as the complexity of the movement of experience increases, the ability to integrate, to focus that meaning, becomes less and less available. It gets harder and harder to go deeper and deeper. And the reason for this is that one has to learn to unhook, to disconnect the relationality between experience and interior concentration. For meditation to go much further than really just superficial levels. Let's use the analogy of the ocean. The ocean is deep enough at parts of this particular planet to be about 37,000 feet deep. Sunlight penetrates maybe 100, 200 feet. In the sunlight areas is about as far as experience allows integration to go naturally. If one wants to go much below the 200 feet into the 37,000 feet of capacity, one has to then go into a transition, a migration of meaning from natural reference to symbolic reference. The natural references are carried by images, and an imaginary way of integrating is just the surface of the mind, just the top sunlit surface of the ocean. And if one wants to go deeper than that, you have to change the referentiality of imagination from nature to something else. And that change of referentiality means that language now has to speak in a way in which initially it never could. The miracle that language can operate at all is now compounded doubly by the further miracle that one has to learn. Let's use a negative example for the moment. One has to learn, as George Orwell warned us against, one has to learn a double talk, a new speak, where words do not mean what they meant. You use the very words, but they on purpose now do not mean what they meant. But when you purposefully use a new speak, a double talk, what you get is the sense of an allegory, the sense of a metaphor, the sense of a paradox, the sense of an irony. And in fact, the emotional tone of being able to use natural language in a symbolic way for the first time, the emotional tone that accompanies that practice, that usage, is one of a sense of irony. The very first step in acquiring a symbolic language is indicated that you experience a sense of irony. So the most famous irony in the world is the irony of Socrates, because he's the first teacher in the world to use ironic language to convey a deeper integral quality from that available by nature. And all through subsequent history, one finds the greatest of all intelligences in the Western tradition understanding this. When we come back from the break, we'll start exactly here. Let's take a break. So we are talking about the sense of irony being the first indication. The first indication that the language, referential of nature, is being interiorized, and therefore you have two possible referential fields. And the sense of irony is characterized in the Western world mainly by the Socratic sense of irony, Socrates' sense of irony, because it's the most publicized, the most famous, the original literary expression in Plato's dialogues. So that Socrates' sense of irony, for instance, was the subject of the doctoral dissertation of Søren Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard's first book is called The Socratic Irony. Kierkegaard being one of the most poignant symbolic thinkers of the 19th century. The father of existentialism is Kierkegaard, even before Nietzsche. But when irony deepens into paradox. The sense of irony deepening becomes paradox, and paradox is the indication that the foot has shifted its weight from nature as a natural referent to the interior realm of meaning, and the referents now are more symbolic. So that irony is a sense that mythic language is beginning to push against its limitations, to exceed what natural referential experience would seem to indicate. And paradox is that the weight has shifted to the interiorization of language. That now symbolic meaning takes precedence over ritual experience. But what stops the deepening of irony into paradox are the curtailments of the ego. And the first curtailment is to reduce the sense of irony to punning. The almost universal use of punning in the computer field is indication of future troubles. Puns are lowest form of humor, not because they're groaners, but because they stop the deepening of irony into paradox. James Joyce's stream of consciousness, language, so beautifully developed from Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Dubliners into Ulysses, becomes punning word games in Finnegan's Wake and stops the deepening of irony into the paradox of transformation. Once language becomes paradoxical, then transformation begins its juices. The juices begin to flow. Why is language this formative? Because language is the ocean out of which the objectivity of the interior symbolic self is formed. It's the very stuff. It's the context and the soup. It's the stew and the frame. It's the way in which the form and the content come together and are objectified. So that the movements and motions of language for symbolic objectivity are again another case, just like existential material coagulates out of the mystery of nature. The universe is always a natural mystery. The actuality of the universe is a natural mystery, not a mystery play, not at all, and not mysterious, not at all. But it's a mystery in that it is never objective. Nature is never objective. There's always a ritual delimitation that's constitutive of form that then makes existence. So existence is always a special case of the mystery. All existences are special cases, in every case delimited from the overall mystery of the universe. It's the delimitation that gives objectivity to form, so that bodies are at once an interface of objectivity, a guarantee of existence, and a delimitation from mystery. The refusal to accept this on the basis of the ego leads to its projective need to constantly balance the delimitations necessary to the structure of existence with what it conceives to be needed balances. So it's not a sign of illness at all. It's just simply a sign of that phase, that stage of needing to balance out. The neurotic is anxious about irony in the most fundamental way. Anything that begins to color outside the lines of ritual and gives rise to the initial perfume of irony, that's a danger. It must be stamped out, must be combated. If one raises this to level of struggle of good and evil on ancient mythic level, then God, Yahweh, combats the monster in the sea, the monster in the ocean. And one has all of this kind of archetypal struggle. And one level of mythic God then combats against the previous level of mythic God. Zeus combats against Kronos. time. The sky, with its form seemingly open and unlimited, is nevertheless threatened by a possible irony because it has come out of a much larger openness, time itself. And that the sky can darken into night still shows its ritual subservience to the natural context of time, day and night. And Zeus's sky, his blue sky, his vast open sky, every 12 hours is completely swallowed by time, which brings on a direct complement and opposite. Zeus's single sun is shown up to be one among an infinite number of stars and suns. So the threat that's there is a threat which is, in the most fundamental way, natural. There's nothing sick about it at all. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing evil. There are no errors. You haven't done anything. No one has done anything. All of those justifications are actually projections and egotistical storms in a teacup, which when they vanish, leave no traces whatsoever. Not at all. There's no hidden level. Even in a 10-dimensional superstring universe, there's no pocket where there's some residual of their occurrence. There's no space, however metaphysical, however para, that records anything whatsoever. And so in the most forthright, plain way, they are illusion. And to believe in them as efficacious is delusion. But that illusion and its concomitant delusion are like glistens that happen because of a certain structure that's occurring. It's like a bubble, and as long as the bubble occurs, there's going to be a glistening on the membrane surface of that bubble. It's a concomitant with that structure and that form. The ego is like a bubble. And because the bubble can burst, indeed it does burst, in no way obviates the real. In no way creams you, in no way terminates you. Because it turns out the you which is dependably you, the you which is objectively you, doesn't even occur on that level, in that cycle. You're not a natural object. You're not dependent on ritual comportment for your existentiality. You're not even dependent on your mind for that. And that's why in this education, all of this is spread out in a double cycle way in order to make it easier to understand and easier in retrospect to begin to use this kind of geometry of process in order to educate yourself in a way to the fullness which would naturally be truncated at level of early symbolism, superficial mind. No being of any conscious potential on any star system is without trepidation facing a further deepening of symbolic objectivity. It's a natural occurrence. It's a cosmic, trustable event. Doesn't matter what shape you are, humanoid or not. That phenomenon is going to occur. That membrane of transition is going to be there. And it will be formative in a structural way in the way in which nature and consciousness complement each other. So there's a universal understanding between beings who have done this, who have gone through this, who have achieved maturity, which includes this. There are no space aliens in any dimension, in any galactic ecology, that are exempt from this or need to be exempt from this. An exemption from this would be a guarantee of some kind of egotistical delusion. But in order to establish this for yourself in a trustworthy, operative certainty, you need to be educated. And the education is not a learning by instruction of some previously digested body of information which is now spooned out to you. That's not the model at all. That's an egotistical thought bubble about what an education would be. It's totally nonsensical. But you cannot be addressed this way initially, naturally, at all. Because you will not hear it, first of all. And secondly, if you could hear it, you wouldn't believe it. The not hearing it and the not believing it are two separate but related levels of structural occurrence that always happen. Someone once said, the sure sign of something being new is that it's objected to on two grounds. First of all, it's not new, and secondly, it's not true. I have presented this education to provosts of major world universities, and they have universally come through with that response. Well, yeah, but that's not new, and it's not really relevant. Well, there's a great books reading list. Yeah, we know all about that. Do you? They themselves are uneducated. You can't put hedgehogs into the cockpits of jet planes and expect them to fly. They crawl out. They not only don't fly, they don't stay in the cockpit. They don't recognize that they've been put in the driver's seat. Because for them, it's an inoperative scale of actuality. There's a great book about Leo Tolstoy's philosophy by Isaiah Berlin called The Hedgehog and the Fox. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. The ego's like a hedgehog. It knows one big thing, and with that single club, it stuns anything that gets in its way. But one has to be a hermetic, quicksilver, mercurial fox in order to understand that this very wide world, and beyond it are worlds wider yet, and that you are wider than all of them. Why be satisfied with being a stalk of celery when you can be a cosmos? It's on that scale of proportion. It's exotically nonsense. It's colossally astounding. I remember as a boy riding my bicycle, too young to drive, looking for science fiction paperbacks in drugstores all over the little town where I grew up, having discovered science fiction. And one druggist saying, "Science fishing? Why, boy, all you need to do is bait a hook." Missed it totally. The ego misses it totally, structurally. That is, that it is structurally made to miss that. That's its whole function and purpose, is to miss the transformation. because they don't transform. And so instead of irony transforming into paradox, it gets short-circuited and grounded by puns, which, as you use them more and more, cut off the transformative grammatical qualities of language. It's like the disease that hit Sanskrit as a language and then hit German as a language. The disease was called prefix and suffixitis, two related maladies. Instead of having new words, they would just put a new prefix or a new suffix, and then that's supposed to be the new word. And eventually the words get so long that they're unusable, they're cumbersome. Sanskrit and German at very high levels have words that make anti-establishmentarianism look small. There are titles to sutras in the high Dharma that in Sanskrit are so long that you couldn't say them in one breath. You can't hold your breath that long. And so as a deep, ironic paradox, high Dharma teachers reduced the sutras to smaller and smaller size till they finally got to a sutra that was one syllable. Ah. And if you could get ah, then you got ah. It's that quality where symbolic language is able to transcend natural language. And natural language generates imagination, whereas symbolic language integrates imagination and transforms it into realization. And the more that realization comes into play, the less imagination comes into play. So that when you're really insightful, you will not imagine anything whatsoever. There won't be one iota of imagination. There will be only realization. So instead of there being some content which has an exclamation mark after it, there will be only the exclamation mark. And instead of saying something, Zen master will simply or the sound of one hand clapping. An education that does not just simply factor this in is incomplete. But one has to do more than factor it in. One has to make it an operative, integral, distributed throughout the entire field of inquiry. A really powerful third millennium, 21st century education requires us understanding that something new isn't just factored in. It isn't just another strand that's added to the braiding. But that its existence also transforms from a ritual comportment to a symbolic realization. And in doing so, its symbolic realization must be distributed throughout the entire field of the inquiry, not just another strand to be braided in as some kind of existential quality, as something else on the list. But its transformative objectivity must be distributed equally into the entire field of inquiry. Now, the normal kind of English word for this field of inquiry would be awareness. Awareness. The field of awareness. And running out of that field of awareness is the stream of consciousness. It's like if you put it into some kind of mythic projection bordering on the paradoxical, one would come out with a field of awareness like the Garden of Eden, and the stream of consciousness that comes out as a four-river quaternary that waters the world. Or if you trace it back, if you reverse that, one could come on any one of four streams to the center, back to paradise. But not only can you do an object and its reverse, there's also the obverse and its contrapositive. There's always a four-part quality to it. But that four-part quality has its complementation. And so when one looks at the entire bracketed possibility, one is dealing with an 8-phase or an 8-part fabric, field, realm. Now, it's very difficult to keep track of this when one is speaking in this kind of non-objective way. And so if we looked objectively, that's what this education is. It allows us to objectify, to lay it out on the table, to put it out to where we can return to it from any angle of vision, any angular momentum whatsoever. It's as universal as that. Once you can lay it out in this kind of a form, it's approachable from any which way. And whatever way that you approach it, it has a coordinated context which allows you to compare it, to contrast it, to pair it up, to connect it with anybody else's angle of vision, anybody else's angular momentum, and put it into a universal context. And once you can do that, objectify it for yourself, what am I doing with this? And connect in any way, by comparison, by contrast, by parallel, by irony, by paradox, with any other. Once you have two angles of vision, once you have two angular momentums, one then gets a revolutionary transformational capacity out of geometry into trigonometry. From the plane of the real to the sphere of the real. And once you get spherical about it all, then all the dimensional qualities of it fall into a place which they didn't have before. It's as if before you were operating on a flatland. There's a famous science fiction novel called Flatland by a fellow named Abbott. Like it's reprinted by Dover Paperbacks, about 100 pages. Two-dimensional beings would have no capacity to imagine a three-dimensional world. Three-dimensional beings have no way to imagine a four-dimensional world. Four-dimensional beings have no way to imagine a five-dimensional world. So if you add the three dimensions of space and the dimension of time to the dimension of consciousness, a five-dimensional continuum, even somebody who is living very effectively in time-space would not be able to imagine that, because imagination doesn't carry transcendently. Its referentiality is always back to the base upon which it is founded. It never looks ahead. It cannot structurally turn its head around. So one runs across the very origins of Zen. It was not called Zen. It wasn't even called Chan. It wasn't even called anything except maybe Tao. The original Zen master was Chuang-Tzu. Chuang-Tzu lived about the time of Alexander the Great in China. And Chuang-Tzu writes about this mysterious way in which, having seen himself as a bird who flew south long enough, now flies north. That simple change of vector is impossible for a referentiality that is still conditioned by ritual existence and ritual comportment. The ambidextrous freedom comes out of equanimity, which takes one out of this past vector orientation into an ambidextrousness. One can look ahead as easily as one looks back. One can look both ways at once. One has then this openness, and when you have an openness, it's like Mendeleev discovering that there's a quaternary. Not only do you have the equanimity, but you have the further pair of developments. Not only do you have the sweet pea flowers that went into play, but you have the two combinations that weren't there originally. You have some pinks. Let's look at that. Let's look at this objectively for just a second in terms of the education. When we began this morning, we talked about how symbols 4 is related in terms of the first year's ecology to ritual 4. So you look at symbols 4. Symbols 1 through 4 are characterized by a pair of books. We're using all kinds of structural elements here which make it finally very easy to check back. We're using To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf and As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. So that the symbols 4 is the culmination of a 4-phase inquiry using these two books as our operative walking pair. What operative walking pair of books did we use at the beginning of ritual? We used Black Elk's The Sacred Pipe and Gladys Reichardt's Navajo Men sand paintings. So somehow the ritual pair of Black Elk's 7 rituals of the calumet, the sacred pipe, that cycle of rituals centered upon an integral of imagery that can be characterized ritually by a sand painting. It doesn't make that much difference that the ritual cycle is Blackfoot out of the Algonquin language for black elk, and that the Navajo is Athabascan language out of the sand paintings. The Navajo are originally from southern Alaska, and the Blackfoot, the Algonquin, are very recent migration immigrants through those very Mackenzie River Valley passes. They're related together. In fact, the Navajo and the Blackfoot are cousins. The Blackfoot in southern Alberta, being blessed with having the first cut of buffalo meat for several thousand years, had a lot of time on their hands, and when they discovered the utility of the horse, which the Navajo also always used, the Algonquin nations on the plains always used the horse, just like the Navajo always used the horse. Among all the Indians of the Americas, only those cousins developed the power of the horse. And so when you find the Sioux, or you find the Blackfoot, or you find the Pawnee, or you find the Cheyenne, you find the Stoney, you find the Navajo, there's the horse that's been factored in, has been distributed throughout the culture. And Blackfeet, who would finish the food harvest early, would ride the 1,700 miles down to visit their cousins, the Navajo, all the time. So there was a living bridge between the mythologies of the Blackfoot and the Navajo, a living cultural comportment, a living ritual comportment. Black Elk's way of talking about the Sioux and the Blackfoot, and that kind of ritual cycle of the sacred pipe, the calumet. ties very closely into the way in which Gladys Reichard discovered. As remember, we talked about the female anthropologists taking themselves to experience the tribes instead of taking ideas of anthropological cookie cutters to categorize the tribes. They went there to live with them, to bring their experience up to par. Like women, they went to live with those families, and they got interested in the family relationalities, and they learned the ritual, mythological, symbolic meaning of all of this from a completely different angle. They learned it from inside the Hogan. They learned it from inside of the family. And so their books, they're like Reichard's great book on Navajo religion, become like universal expression of intelligence. They're not just period monographs that are now out of date. They're the expressions of a whole range of mythic experience, which is true always and applicable always. There are parallels everywhere. Black Elk with the sacred pipe rituals of the Calumet, the Oglala Sioux medicine man, the Sioux and the Blackfeet, the Northern Plains tribes, Affine with the Navajo tribes, that whole ritual selection has a relationship to Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner. They're symbolic novels written in stream of consciousness. And just as there is a kind of flow for the ritual cycle, the 7 rites of the sacred pipe flow like a rim of a circle, and the sand painting is like that kind of center which one would find in a mandala. It's like a mandala is at the very center of a ritual cycle. The mandala itself is the result of the accumulation of the ritual cycle happening. And when the ritual cycle is complete, one then also has the center. One has the mandala. The making of the mandala is the whole ritual cycle. The making of the sand painting is that whole ritual cycle. This parallels in the way in which Faulkner's cycle, As I Lay Dying. But instead of being a ritual cycle, it's a symbolic cycle. If you look at As I Lay Dying, you will not find numbers, but you will find 59 sections, just simply labeled by names. And after the names will be stream of consciousness of that person. As you change the name, the stream of consciousness changes. It's a different person all the way through. There are 59 of these. They almost complete a circle. If there were 60, it would complete the circle. But it's just like in a American Indian wisdom circle. One never completes it. One leaves one element out. It's like a Navajo sand painting never completes itself. There's always, if it's woven, there's always one thread on the rug that doesn't fit. Called, Gladys Reichard introduced the name into English language. She called it a spirit trail. It's a secret portal. It's a symbolic portal by which we enter and leave without disturbing the structure. It's a fallopian tube of rebirth through which we can traverse both ways for fertility and for birth and not disturb the form. That the form mothers us, gives birth to us, and isn't destroyed in doing so. That there's always an opening. Just like in a Zen Sumi archetypal painting, one has the big circle and it doesn't quite close. It doesn't quite close because that space That space is the spirit trail. Just like the way in which nerve cells arrange themselves in the brain, there's always a synaptical gap between the dendrites of one cell and the axons of another. There's always that openness, that space, that place. As Dylan Thomas once said of poetry, a good poet doesn't seal the poem with words. He leaves spaces for the lightning and thunder to come through. Or Chuck Berry one time told Steve Miller and Boz Scaggs in a kitchen in San Francisco, he said, "You white boys are pretty good, but you got to leave some spaces for the audience to fill in. If they're with your music, they'll fill them in. They'll hear notes that you don't play, but it'll be sweeter because the song will be there and they'll be with it." That leaving of that space is archetypal. And just like in any natural cycle, if you close the cycle, then it's a circle. And it continues. I think the most popular symbol in our generation of the snake swallowing its tail, the Ouroboros. They're even using it for the new TV series, Millennium. The snake swallowing its tail, the old Egyptian symbol of an endless circle of repetitive ritual. It's not at all the symbol of transformation. The symbol of transformation does not have the closed circle. The symbol for a new millennium is not the symbol of endless repetition. It's a symbol of transformation. And the serpent swallowing its tail is not transformation, it's endless repetition. Someone can see that there's the perfect symbol for the ignorance of this generation, who no longer even know how to speak. In the last wave, Peter Weir's great film of the lack of comprehension, the lawyer, played by Richard Chamberlain, is on a bridge there, the big bridge over Sydney Harbor. And Gulpil, the Aboriginal man, says, you can't tell me anything about reality. You don't even know who you are. Because you don't know how to read symbols anymore. And what's worse, you don't know how to transform by using that symbolic language. And so largely this generation is going back into the ground, short-circuiting itself on clever puns, on manuals that are supposed to lead into a technological breakthrough, on new TV shows that are supposed to be the latest thing at the close of millennium. John Milius, in his screenplay for Apocalypse Now, said, "Man, you needed wings to fly above the shit." It got that deep in Vietnam. By leaving the opening, one gets the lightning and thunder coming through. One gets the spirit trail. In a mandala, there is always that quality where the resonance is the spirit trail. In the Navajo sand painting, it's a single thread that's left open. Whereas in a mandala, there's always this ability for the resonant wholeness of it to escape. In a real primordial mandala, one would have, just underneath the defining rim of the mandala, one would have a realm, which is called the realm in Buddhism, it's called Preta. The hungry ghosts. The hungry ghosts who need to be fed. The images of the past that want our blood, want our nourishment, demand it. You must feed me. The realm of the Preta, of the hungry ghost, is just under the defining realm of the membrane of the mandala. So that if one were going into one's deep self for the first time, the first thing you come to is realm of preta, hungry ghosts. As Carl Jung said, first thing that comes up in a good analysis is the shadow. The first thing that comes up is the embodiment of the negativities. So the first sign of health is that it gets radically worse right away. Because you're detoxing. Why wouldn't it get worse? It should get worse. It's a good sign that it gets worse right away. So a good sign of an education that's beginning to work is right away you experience for the first time maybe in your life that you didn't understand a thing. What did she say? What did he say? The inability to understand what is being said is the first step in developing a sensitivity that later will come up as grass and irony, and will flower in paradox, and will fruit in transformation. That's the way it is. So if you can follow something all the way through first time, you didn't learn anything, you just deepened the rut. The little track in which the greyhounds chase the mechanical rabbit because somebody else is winning money betting that they'll go faster or slower. It's a fool's play. As we move to Symbols 5 next week, we're taking a second pair of books. We're taking a new set of legs to walk on. We're taking Suzanne Langer's Philosophy in a New Key, and we're taking William Blake's illustrations to the book of Job. Two different books. What pair of books did we use in ritual? The second phase of ritual, we used the Bacchae, a Greek tragedy by Euripides, in fact, the last great Greek tragedy, and the Satipatthana Sutra of the historical Buddha, the Mindfulness Sutra. The end of tragedy, the culmination of tragedy, and the beginnings of mindfulness coalesce, but they don't meet. They're separated by a gap of intuition that cannot have a materiality to follow. It has to leap over. It has to jump from one to the other. Mindfulness never proceeds from tragedy in its ritual form, but tragedy in its ritual form can take us to the threshold of a paradoxical intuition that leaps to mindfulness. We are such that we can make that leap. It seems to the ego that one could never make it. Oh, one can't do that. In Chuangzi, he says, there's a whole bush full of little birds that say, we have heard of a bird that is so great that it flaps its wings once and soars 100,000 miles. We know this is garbage. It's not true. All of us fly all our lives, and we can barely make it from one bush to another. The scale of the real is astounding because it's completely open. You can be as magical as you need to be to transform to whatever you can be. But you cannot imagine it in any way whatsoever. So stopping the ritual foundations of imagination temporarily is actually a sign of transformational health. Disconnecting symbols from images is a beginning of a deeper wisdom. But in doing so, all of the negativity, all the precariousness comes into play instantly right away. All of it. And the more complete that one does this, the more cold turkey, the more the negativity simply swirls around you, drowns you. It needs to, it should, it has to. Not because you did something wrong, but because you did something right. Not because you're bad, but because you're real. It needs to do this. It's functional. You can weather it. Not only can you weather it, but you can factor it in. Not only can you factor it in, but you can distribute it in such a way that its negativity never occurred. Its actuality is what is stressed. So the ancient wisdom saying is that life is neither a tragedy nor a comedy. It's a mystery. And what a mystery leads to is not a shriek of terror, nor a laugh at punning, but it leads to the discovery, the actuality that you are. And that frees. It frees on a scale of permanence. Because there's no conditionality that can reach that far. Conditionalities themselves are delimited to existence and its concomitant experience, and goes just a little ways into interiority, about 200 feet into an ocean that's much more than 7 miles deep. One is not just free, but free forever, permanently. This is called a cure. And so instead of the kind of education that's just pill rolling to get you through another day, there's such a thing as getting cured so you don't have to take medicine ever again. It's called moksha from the ego standpoint. It's called something else from the differential standpoint. It's called nirvana, using that same language. So our education leads someplace. Where it leads to, don't try to imagine. But by going there, it will occur. The best proof of the pudding is not eating it, but learning how to make it again in endless varieties and then eating all of it. Enough for today. Please remember your checks for $25 to help me pay my little bills. And I hope that you will get these 2 books. If you don't have time to read them, at least divinatorially, bibliomantically, you can hold them together and rub them together and hope that something will happen between them. And when you do that long enough and nothing happens, you might take my suggestion to read them.